Thank you all, and thanks to Gray and the Frontrunners team for having me to come speak with you all. Today I'm going to talk about design systems from 0 to 1, so taking the first steps towards unifying your user interface. I run a company called Meticulous. I've been doing UX and product brand, things of that nature for about 25 years now. And I'm also a part-time Rails developer, a musician, and permaculturist. So if you want to talk about farms or homesteading stuff, I milked a cow this morning, ask me anything. So what is a design system? I'm going to start with a grenade. Your design system is not your Figma file. Some designers would disagree with me, but these are artifacts, right? A design system is a much more holistic thing, but the Figma file itself is not the system. And a lot of people think of the little component pieces as the system and jump too far ahead. And so they'll say, we need a design system. And what they mean is we need to standardize some design components, but they don't really know what they're thinking about yet. So the formal definition, and this comes from the Nielsen-Norman Group, is that a design system is a set of standards to manage design at scale by reducing redundancy and creating a shared language and visual consistency across different pages and channels. So you think about it's not just a web app. Now we start talking about the brand marketing materials, the mobile app, the web application, things of that, emails, so your support experience, all that stuff. So this is a new thing that has effectively grown up in the last decade. A decade ago, we barely had brand guidelines. Now, for web apps, now we have this. And everyone's doing one. So Salesforce has Lightning, which is recent and pretty comprehensive. Apple's human interface guidelines is probably the longest running thing you could think of that would fall under a design system. There's also Nord Health, which is an excellent one, and then I've got Adobe Spectrum hanging out there. And then we heard Jordan mention earlier the US web design system. That's a pretty comprehensive one and lots of great resources there. So why might you need one? You don't. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. I'll see you. But in all seriousness, too often people dive right in and they start building a design system from scratch and they end up with a bigger mess than they started with. What you want to do is look at what you're trying to solve for. What are the likely pain points? And there are really two big ones, and they're your pain points. They're consistency and efficiency. A design system is a product that serves developers. At the end of the day, it helps create less diversity in the sense of this interface has this button and this interface has this button, and there's a fourth button that showed up yesterday. We don't know where that came from. That's one thing. And then efficiency. You should be able to get to your final product faster. There should be a lot less of you having to go in and say, oh, what's that hex code I need to pull? No, you know that's brand red. You don't even have to look at it. So these are two things also that we can track. We can actually set metrics up around these things and understand them. So when we are sitting there at the end of the quarter or the end of the year, how did the design system work? Well, let me tell you a story. That story is about how our design team got more consistent and more efficient this year. Design systems are also a product. If you think it's built and done, you're going to end up with something that then goes out of date. So this needs to have the same product management mentality that you approach any software you're building. You have constant revisions on it. You have a backlog. You're going to be looking at user testing, discovery. All these things have to happen on the design system in order for it to be a long-term effective product. And I'm preaching to the choir, but developer experience matters. This is something that, if you think about APIs and all sorts of things like that, at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that developers have had to deal with, bad documentation being a pretty obvious one. But if you think about API documentation before Stripe, for example, and then how Stripe changed that game with such a robust documentation set for development, that's the kind of experience that we want to improve on. So how do I take my first steps? We're going to talk about discovery, and a lot of this is coming down to getting a good foundation. So the first thing, this sounds really loosey-goosey and like, ooh, design, okay, they're going to go make some pretty pictures. But design principles are different than that. It's why do we do what we do? What's going to drive our decisions? If you want to think about a car company, one of their design principles might be safety first. That's going to affect decisions that they make. So like now all these designs in cars are going to these big touchscreens. Well, there's a lot of research that shows that that's not easy to see. You have to take your eye off the road, connect to that piece, touch it, and then get back on target on the road. Why is the Apollo command module and the space shuttle and all these systems, why were they all physical switches? Because you can grab it and you know where it is, and you know you have it, and you can flip it, and you have a click, and you know it activated. This is the kind of stuff to think about. Like that was a design choice. So if your design principle isn't safety first, you might be like, yeah, that looks cool, and we've got this cool animated background now on our driver dashboard. It looks really nice on when Tim Cook gets up and shows it on the Apple quarterly review. But at the end of the day, it's not very safe. So look at Etsy, for example. This is Etsy's design principles. They went and created a working group. They spent 6 months just going through and trying to figure out, what do we want to do? Who do we want to be? And this may seem frou-frou, but if you don't do this stuff, there's competing mentalities that develop. And this is from an article that Megara Moon put out. It's on Medium, and you can look this up about their Etsy design principles. And there's a lot of great detail there. But so they created this working group, and they basically, one of the main whys that is mentioned in the article is that excellent design means unity. Does everything we do feel essential? Does it work together? And is it going to create a holistic experience? So there's 3 steps you're going to do in this phase. And these are just kind of like a lot of brute force work. And the first is the UI audit. So a UI audit is basically, you can call it a UI safari. There's lots of terms for this kind of thing. But you're going to go through and screenshot every single page in your app. And so this is a product I'm actually working on right now. And this, we went through and screenshotted all the different experiences. So we set up, made sure we had accounts that had access, because different accounts are going to have different roles. They're going to see screens differently. Went through and documented all of those. And then you've got to say, what are all these components? You're going to start seeing, especially in apps that have evolved over a couple years, we have 7 different left navs. We have 15 different buttons. They may be all very similar, but you're going to start noticing some changes. A famous one, this is from PNC many years ago, probably 10, 15 years ago. They went through and audited all their buttons, and this is what came out. And this is a lot of fun, a lot of different brands in there, but that's all PNC in air quotes, right? So they started with this, realized they had a problem, and then started unifying it and cleaning it up. It's not always that bad. Like I said, this is that massive screenshot thing. This is the buttons that ended up out of that. What's interesting is some of these are tags. Can you tell me which ones are tags versus buttons? No, because they look exactly the same. So but you'll notice even on the orange buttons, some of the stuff that's changed, like we have a slightly larger plus sign here, slightly smaller text, but the button's the same size. You know, we've got big text, little text, we've got a taller button, we've got a narrower button, we have a secondary version of that button. Then we have a gray secondary version of that button. We have an unstyled choose button. Then we have a whole different color scheme that pops in here. So these are the kind of things that you'll notice, and you start to say, oh, okay. This isn't a huge step, but we can take it to a better level. And one of the things, also the primary color here was orange, which is not necessarily the best color you want to use for positive reinforcement. So we'll show you something else here in a minute on this. Brand standards. So brand standards have been around forever. This is actually from 2004, super vintage. I mean, those flip phones in the bottom right. Pretty awesome. But this was Nextel. This is one of the best examples of a comprehensive brand guideline out there. It used to be a lot easier to find. I had to go digging in my hard drive to find it this time. But if you think about it, the guys define the do's and don'ts for all sorts of aspects. And usually these are focused on marketing and print. You'll also see video and some things like that. But they're going to say, here's the type to use, here's the type to not use. Here's the style, like the levels of fonts. Here's the different colors. These are our brand colors. Usually they're referencing the Pantone color system because that's how they're going to print. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff. But you'll also see what we call lockups. So here's how I combine these elements together for this use. This is what design systems evolved from. This was the design system for print for Nextel, if you want to think about it that way. And so, you also, like, the brand coloring is really an important thing. And you'll notice sometimes, this is one I did recently for a scout organization, and you'll notice you got the Pantone. I have the CMYK because sometimes we're printing at a digital printer and Pantone doesn't matter. I have the RGB and I have the hex. What you'll find sometimes is something that looks amazing on a piece of paper looks really weird when you throw it on a screen, especially in like the warm and cool grays. So I'll have a nice dark it looks almost gray on the Pantone color, and you pop that into Photoshop, and it is brown. It is not. It is really, really brown, and it's not like the kind of color you were like, oh, I liked that kind of muted, just like dark cream vibe, and it's like, nope, that is not good. So you want to go through and you're going to adjust these to say, hey, well, that's great for print, but we need to come up with our own colors for the web, and they're derivative from the brand, and there's also a whole lot of utility stuff. I don't think I've ever used this many shades of gray on a print piece, but I've used it almost every single web app. I've at least had 7 shades of gray, if not 10. And this is something where I've now started to do everything where I have a base middle gray, and I use SAS Math with this tool down here at the bottom where you can just do it in SAS itself to go ahead and create the variations. So, and then you can see up top, those are the color variables from Tailwind that we've assigned these to. So when somebody is defining gray 100, they don't have to go look that up. They just know that's our lightest gray. And if they want the next level down, they know it's 200. And we have all that referenced in that config file. And then we align that with the color names in our Figma file or our sketch file. Some of this is also applying the brand to the app. So I worked on Procore back in 2015, and Procore at the time, the app looked like Basecamp 1. And what the brand was great. It was, a very white page, had nice tans, had, very they were orange, but construction orange, right? That made sense for that brand. But the app looked nothing like it. It could have been, it really was, they took the Basecamp tabs across the top and smacked it on the page. So we started evolving it and bringing the brand in. I brought Karen Owens, who's now the creative director there, but she was like the lead brand designer at the time. And we evolved this down to now, when I left, this is where we had left it at. So it felt much more like the marketing site, felt a lot more like the marketing materials of the time. It's now 8 years, this is 8 years ago, so it's all changed dramatically. But gives you an idea of like bringing those brand elements into your app, especially if your app's never had anything like that happen, this is a good time to do it. And a huge part of this is typography, as annoying as that is, getting the fonts and getting the relationship between the fonts right, so you always have a headline that looks the same. You always have your links are always the same. And getting these things standardized as text elements in the design files and then in code too. So I will use a silent extend in SAS, for example. And that way I can say heading 1, and then I define what heading 1 is, and I include heading 1 or extend heading 1. However I want to do it, if a mix in or an extend. And that way you have that unified. So now if I want to say, hey, we need to update this because we've had an accessibility test and the color's off, I don't have to go find every instance of that. I go update the master. Finally, I'm going to take a look at my existing components. A lot of us are working in component-based systems like React. If you're working in something like Rails or something like that, this may be a little harder. But what are the existing components? How are they made? Where do you have commonalities? Last year, I spent 8 months reskinning an app, and there were 5 or 6 different card components. And they were completely unrelated. The CSS names were all different, but they all looked kind of in the same family. So unifying that was a big part of that process, right? So looking at these kind of things, seeing what you have. And that's what you're going to start to do. The next step is taking those components and starting to unify them. A lot of this can be achieved with global CSS declarations. If you want to use Tailwind, whatever, that's fine. But getting the same thing in the same place, so you can now update card. And card is going to update across the board. Now I'm going to have a subclass of that, and we're going to have card with picture, card no picture, whatever. You can start stacking those class names, but everything inherits from card, right? So you're extracting up. Same way we would do this with just our regular software code. Let's leverage the benefit of inheritance to not have to copy and paste things over and over again. This is also a great opportunity at this point to ensure that you have accessible components. Run it through Stark, use the WCAG accessibility testers, make sure that your contrast ratios are good, things of that nature. All those buttons I showed you, this is where all those buttons ended up. These are all the possible states of the button. Icon, no icon, and then icon solo. So you don't see the no icon version here. But the base button, primary and secondary are the 2 columns. Then there's hover, click, disabled, and this is the outline. If you're tabbing through something, the outline highlight that should show up for accessibility. So that is, all those different buttons became this. In some cases, you may need to have a small and a large version of the button as well, but I would encourage you to try and figure out how to have fewer variations of things when you're working through this. You're going to start taking this, which is a micro component, and putting them into either what some people would call patterns. If you're doing atoms, molecules, atomic design, that kind of thing, though this is like the molecule level, right? This is the next step. We have 2 buttons, we have a header, and we have a date change filter here. And this is a lockup. So every time on every page, this is the standard lockup. I want to change this up for the page. Why? Is there a good reason? Functionally, why is this changing? That's a question that you're going to want to ask. And you want to push back on this, because sometimes I'm a designer and I will often be like, oh, this looks great, this looks pretty, I threw this thing in here. 5 whys. Get down to the why. Why do we need the change? We have gotten rid of standardization because it's cool, but what are we doing? Is there a benefit to the user for making this change? So that's kind of like, that's like starting off. And at the end of that little system and that flow right there, you now have unified components. If you just do that, you're going to be so much better off than you were 6 months ago. But how do we deploy this, right? It's really easy to say, oh, we're going to change all our components. So with atomic design, right, we break these things down and we go through and we start looking at this. So I could say, hey, I'm going to roll this out for this one kind of user class. Or I'm going to use Flipper or some kind of other technology to serve a different site. And I can start saying with the micro components, then I build those into these pieces and start building up. And one thing we did back at Living Social, this is 2012. So this is pre-design systems, but this is effectively an early design system. Internal tools at the time, this is where we proposed to take internal tools. It was all scaffolded Rails views. There was no design. It was literally slapped together. So we came up with a bunch of mocks and said, here's some ideas, showed it to the CTO, and he said, that's like 18 months of work. We said, well, yeah, but that's not what we're trying to propose. So we started building certain things, and it turned into that we were using a lot of Bootstrap components, and we said, let's standardize this, let's make it our own. We pulled SCSS Bootstrap, started building on top of it. We called it Wild. And what Wild gave us, we basically had a unified page frame. You'll notice some buttons and standards like that, modal standard, things like that. And all of this you would install with a Ruby gem, run 2 generators, and your app suddenly had all these elements in place. And you could start building. We had this kind of documentation, and I mean, any of you who have used kind of this should all look kind of like, oh yeah, I've seen things like that, right? So this was from Neath KSS, Neath style sheets, back in the day from Kyle Neath from GitHub had a way to do documentation inline that generated this. And hey, look at those buttons. That looks really familiar, doesn't it? Because it's hacked Bootstrap. But instead of just including Bootstrap, we literally pulled the code and rewrote the parts that we wanted. So we weren't including all these things we didn't need. We'd only pull the SCSS across for the things we were going to ship. And so like with our buttons here, that's pretty standard Bootstrap 1. Nothing really dramatic, but we started to tweak the colors a little bit and started to push things in. And if you'll notice, we started to play a lot with a micro copy. That really is where the personality came through. And that was built into the standard. So when we shipped apps, hey, your success, let's work on your success messaging because, that was successfully created. Yay. Like, come on, let's be a little playful. Getting developers to be playful with this stuff. It was, it had to be like, yes, you can be sarcastic in this. This is an internal tool. No one's going to see it. It's just going to be us. So that turned in. This is the customer support tool. It was a 2-screen solution. They used to have to double entry into Salesforce and a Rails app, and then we redid all that. And this is Backbone.js. Talk about vintage, right? But again, see, now you start to see all these things are actually employed. But we didn't roll that out overnight. This is the original site where we started swapping out the pieces. We swapped out the credit cards. We swapped out the header. We swapped out the deal details. So they were getting improvements from day one. As soon as we could build one of these components, we got it in there. And so this is something to think about. Where can I just make improvements to make my users' lives better? And we were able to roll this out. So this rolled out on top of Salesforce with Apex. And then this also rolled out, and this was not Backbone. I don't remember what this was, but this was a scheduling app. Same visual language, but a lot of different functionality. So, leveling up. Talk about tokens. Tokens are just variables. It sounds all magical, but it really is defining a variable. And so this is like from that thing. This is the color declaration. So base, light base, you'll start to see my SAS math in here at the top there. And then sometimes it's just defined hex. So like a lot of things we were using, we pulled in the flat colors, and we just took all the names and dumped them in. So now I can reference brand or base anywhere, and that will automatically be that color. We have a brand change, great, I update the color one place. I don't have to go through and find all the hex values. There's a really cool tool that I don't have time to really show you, but please go play with this. This shows you the power of tokenization. All of these values at the top are variabilized down here. So when I start sliding spacing increments or unit size or the color, everything else changes. It's a super cool example of what you can do if you really build the system right. And being able to flip to dark mode, right? That's all just a bunch of variables that got changed. Everything is unified up in this top variable area. So when you start thinking about how can I apply this across the board, this is a really great way to get there. In building out the system, there's other things that we would not think of necessarily in traditional brand guidelines. Content. Microcopy really has a huge effect on how people interact with your product. So what are those labels? Your buttons should not say, submit. If you see a button that says submit, everybody stop, we're going to rewrite all our button copy. At least have the button say what it's going to do. A great example is on a create form, create object name. That's like level 1. If you want to you can get more fancy from there, but you'll see a lot of these things where it's unclear what cancel means. So I want to cancel my account, submit cancel. Which one do you hit? Yes. Okay. But so the primary action should be cancel my account, and go back maybe is a better copy there, right? So start looking for those things that are confusing and write them out. So content guidelines like that, and standardize how you're going to have buttons. All those buttons should say, maybe we just say our standard is, task object. And you can variabilize that, right? That can become automatically created, so you don't even have to write that copy as a string. It just is automatically populated. Bring in your brand guidelines. Start looking at those. If you don't have brand guidelines, that probably is something you want to talk about with your marketing team and figure that out. If you're so small you don't even have a marketing team, discuss it as a group and see, hey, is this something we can just do? We don't have to do a 50-page document here. Just like we need to pick some fonts and say this is the font. We need to make sure we have the colors, and we're all using the same colors. Toss it in the Figma or the sketch file. You don't even need to go make a nice big PDF of it if you don't want to. If you're doing mobile design, especially, motion is a big thing now. So like animations, transitions, all that kind of stuff. Building out your UI kit. So this enables designers that are either employees or contractors to all start from the same base elements. So they're dragging and dropping elements that you have code for already. So that's this kind of element. That's this component, and I'm now using that here. And then documentation. Good tutorials and documentation will help a lot. You remember, Dave had new guy, right? So that being able to make sure that new guy can come in and go, I got it. Yeah, this is great. I just spent 30 minutes. I watched that video. I now completely understand how to take and implement our buttons on these pages. So how do we take this into real world stuff? Storybook.js is probably one of the best platforms I've found for doing this, especially in the React space. If you're using this, great. There are a lot of this is to the point where if you really spend the time to build these out correctly, you'll have all the instances, you'll have all the states defined, and you can actually see how the thing will change without having to implement it. You can play with it down there. And if you go look at the Storybook site, you can watch how this component in this video, they're actually showing you all the things they can do with it. So I've used this in a couple different places. I've used this in a React app with .NET. We're using this right now in a Rails app with Vue component and Storybook, which is a connection. So even if you're outside of the React space, you can look at building things in component style systems. So Vue component, there's also a new thing in the Rails space called Flex, which is being worked on right now by Joel Draper and some other people. And there's some cool tools coming out in those areas too that you can also look towards, how do I have a source of truth for this code? So state-of-the-art stuff. This is a rapidly changing space. There's a lot of excitement going on here and a lot of things happening. So one thing that's happening here right now, this came out last week. This is called Omelette Dev, and OMLET. And are my components actually being used? I've built out 400 components. Are they being used in the code base? Where are they being used in the code base? How are they being used? It's kind of like a code coverage kind of thing, but for your components. So being able to use this on your design system team and sit there and look at what's getting used. Hey, we built this component, no one touches it. Why? Is the component wrong? Should we just get rid of the component? Because any of that kind of software is maintenance. You have to maintain the code you make. So looking at things like that. And there's a lot of tools on trying to tie this together with developers. So InVision has a great design system manager. They have built-in tokenization. Documentation is all there. It's obviously it's a whole platform you're paying for, but there's a lot of, if you're working on a larger team, it's definitely something to look at. UXPin, Storybook, and Pattern Lab all kind of have different things that they do well in the space. So that if there's something, if you need tooling, there's that. And obviously your Sketch or Figma on the design side is going to be your visual source of truth. And that's going to be kind of where things are generated out of. So to finish up your marching orders, you got to work on design principles, as boring and frustrating as that may seem to go through. Get those solidified because that's going to guide everything else you do. Do your audit. Do your brand guides research. Get those components aligned. And then land and expand and treat it like a product. And it sounds a lot easier. This is a lot of work. I'm not trying to simplify it too much here, but this is going from 0 to 1, right? This is a big lift. But even if you only get to here, you're going to be much, much happier. And in the future, you can start building out all sorts of things that you see in really complex design systems. You don't need to start with that. Start at the bottom, build up, and you'll be well on your way towards having a good functional design system. So that's the talk. If you have any questions, I will be around through the end of the day, and I'd love to chat with you more. Also, I've been working on this for quite a while, but I am actually filming now. So Developer UX is a class about UX for developers, and it will be coming up on Teachable pretty soon. And then if you want to get in touch with me, I'm John Athayde on Twitter, John Athayde at Ruby Social and Mastodon, email, and then got my personal URL. Meticulous is my company, and Developer UX for the class. Thank you.